Okay, I'm in First Corinthians chapter 2. I'm going to start out in verse 7 and 8, and then I'll come back up to verse 1 and 2. Starting out in First Corinthians chapter 2, verse 7, he says, "But we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the ages for our glory, which none of the rulers of this age knew, for had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." If they had known, that's going to be an interesting discussion. I'll talk about that in a message later on. But in this one, I just wanted to introduce from verse 7 that the wisdom of God is hidden. It's a mystery. It's something that is only accessible, in a specific way. All right. Now, first, I'd like to mention that there's probably some really good reasons as to why God would keep His wisdom kind of hidden, why He would keep it a mystery. What would be the reason for that? Why doesn't He just share His wisdom with anybody and everybody? Well, a simple answer that I personally feel is a place to start is to consider that the wisdom of God can definitely be misused. It can be misunderstood. It can be misapplied. It can be used in ways that He never intended it to be used. Just the subject of forgiveness through the crucifixion is a wonderful example of that, where people will take forgiveness, the forgiveness of sins, and use that as their excuse to going out and indulging their flesh. Well, if God doesn't hold it against me, why not just go ahead and do it? And that's a misuse of forgiveness. That's not what God intended when He provided people with forgiveness. So this could also be applied to any part of the wisdom that He may reveal. Now, in order to know the wisdom of God, you have to know God. It's something that He reveals to a person individually, personally. Okay? This is His desire. He doesn't want anybody to know His wisdom unless He shares it with them. Okay? Even though we can testify of what He has shared with us, it still won't be the same. It won't really have as much of an impact, if at all, in comparison to a person hearing it from God directly, from His Spirit testifying within them of the truth, either through confirming the testimony of somebody else or through revelation directly from God. This is what He wants. He wants it to be a personal experience between Him and one other person. Okay, this is why He has been hiding His wisdom. This is why His wisdom is so mysterious, because He doesn't want you to know unless He is the one who shares it with you. Okay, it's not likely that you're going to be able to come up with a really good book titled "The Wisdom of God," and for it to, be quite impressive to people. It just doesn't work that way. So Paul asserts that there is a wisdom of God, but it's something that can only be known by Him personally. You have to discover this as He reveals it to us personally. It turns out that the overwhelming majority of His wisdom requires us to understand some things first. To really know and understand the wisdom of God, we've got to understand certain things before He can define His wisdom. The crucifixion is a fantastic place to start. Does He have wisdom in giving us His acceptance? Is that wise? And what does that really represent about Him and His wisdom towards us? Why was it that we did not have His acceptance before? What were the consequences related to us not knowing his acceptance? And then what would the consequences be if we know his acceptance? There's some wisdom in him, letting people know that he accepts them. Of course, because of what he's done through the cross, not because of what they do or what they don't do. But there's some wisdom there in terms of what are the implications? Where is that going to go? What will be the consequences? In what ways will you know your God personally because of that? You're never going to be able to embrace his acceptance until after you embrace his forgiveness. All right? It's just not going to happen. That's a simple example of the need to know some things before you can know other things. And this is how the wisdom of God is protected. Okay? This is how he keeps it for himself, is that he will only reveal a little bit at a time as it corresponds to our faith, to our response to the truth that he reveals. When we believe what he has declared, then there is an opportunity for him to show us some of his wisdom regarding that. Now, what he says here in verse 7 and 8 about the rulers of this age, if they had known what would happen, if they had known what would take place, they would not have crucified the Son of God. I don't think that it would be because they were concerned about the revelation of the wisdom of God. I think that they were more concerned about, or that the concern would be that there really is a God, and they're probably going to have a conversation with him about what they were doing at some point later in life or in death. That this is something that's going to come up. If they would have known this was the case, they probably would not have participated. I personally think that that's what he was thinking of when he wrote that. Okay, but they had their own wisdom, and they thought that what they were doing was the wise thing to do. They had reasons for the decisions that they made, and these reasons were based on what they thought was right, what they thought was wrong, how they would solve the problems that were presented to them. Okay, the world has a sense of wisdom. There is a wisdom that exists in the world. And in this case, it's contrary to the wisdom of God. It's not the same at all, but it still is something that God used in order to eventually reveal his own wisdom. The wisdom of the world has been worked on for every generation of people, and this wisdom just really hasn't changed. I've spoke previously about the wisdom that was understood through Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and that the writings of Aristotle really are a good representation of all the work of those three different generations. And I personally believe that the reason why his work was so popular was because it was a representation of what people already believed. For a person to be on their own and be a part of this world and to try to figure things out on their own through reason and logic and through experience, this is the kind of stuff that they would come up with. The stuff that was represented through the works of Aristotle. And that this is something that I'm sure was talked about 2,000 years before Aristotle wrote his works on ethics and politics and government. 2,000 years prior, people would be dealing with the exact same issues, the same things, the same subjects, the same relationships with other people. 3,000 years before that, they would have been dealing with these things. Almost 4,000 years. And today, it's the same stuff. The only difference between us today and those people during the time of Aristotle is technology. That's it. Just the technological inventions are really the only difference. The same personal problems that need to be solved exist today just as they did back then, just as they did during the time of the Apostle Paul when he was writing this letter to the Corinthians. Same problems, same struggles. They start out when a person is born. Okay, how are they going to eat? How are they going to have clothing? How are they going to have shelter? The basic fundamentals of life. What are the struggles of the teenagers? What happens when you're in your 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and then you're getting ready to die? The same problems that everybody had to deal with back then, they have to deal with the same kinds of problems today. We just have different technologies that allow us to manage our lives differently. The works of Aristotle are still studied and appreciated today. As far as I know, no one's really been able to come up with anything that's, necessarily more impressive than the works of Aristotle. His works on ethics are very popular. When you take a look at how often his work on ethics is read today, in comparison with the next most popular book that he wrote, which was on politics and government, the one on ethics is read 8 times more often than his work on politics and government. People like to talk about politics and religion, but it turns out they like to talk about religion a lot more. Ethics is just a manifestation of religion. It's the same thing. And so if that's what's going on today, I would suggest that during the time of the Apostle Paul, people were looking at the book of ethics that Aristotle wrote 8 times more than they were looking through the book that he wrote on government and politics. Because that's just the nature of humanity. People don't change. Technology changes, and that's about it. Okay, and so they had a sense of wisdom. The rulers of the world at this time, described in chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, they had a definition of wisdom that was worked through, that was reasoned out. And even if they'd never studied the works of Aristotle, what they believed probably corresponded to it very well. Just because it's the general conclusion that people come to, regardless of what pathway they take. They come to similar conclusions eventually in the context of the wisdom of the world. It still is completely different from the wisdom of God, but that's just the way things go. All right, and so Paul is talking to the Corinthians, who would definitely have had lots of exposure to the wisdom of the world. He's talking to them and he's letting them know, listen, there is a wisdom of God that has been hidden. Okay? Perhaps it's hidden to you too. It's something that you don't know, but it's something to be known. All right? Now, it's not Paul's responsibility to properly educate them in the wisdom of God. That's just not his role. That's what happens when a person has a personal relationship with God. It is God who will reveal his wisdom to us individually in ways that we can understand. And this is normally experienced when we are working through the problems of life, or struggles that we have to deal with, or sufferings that we are enduring. It's in the midst of living our lives that God will speak his wisdom to us to show us how he sees things, how he understands things. All right, this is a personal experience. And so we're not going to see Paul say, okay, this is a chapter on the wisdom of God. You're not going to see that because that's something that God has reserved for himself. He's not going to share the revelation of his wisdom with anyone. What I mean is that he's not going to share with Paul the revelation of his wisdom. He's going to reveal his wisdom personally to you. Not through me, not through somebody else. He's keeping this just for himself. All right? So with that, let's go to verse 1. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1, he says, "And I, brethren, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom, declaring to you the testimony of God. There is a difference between the testimony of God and the wisdom of God. For I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. All right, and you might think that's all that it was. That's all that he was dealing with. No wonder they're a bunch of babies. No wonder they're immature in the faith. If all they've got is Jesus Christ and Him crucified. But that is what opens the door. That is what makes it possible. I gave you the example of acceptance. You can't embrace the reality of God's acceptance until after you embrace the reality of complete forgiveness. Okay, so yes, it's worthwhile to make sure that people understand the implications of the crucifixion, that a person understands what it means to be forgiven and why. Okay, I usually start with the restoration of the Holy Spirit, that forgiveness makes salvation possible, makes it possible for the Holy Spirit of God to stay within us, because there's no sin left unforgiven that would cause the Holy Spirit to depart from us according to the law of sin and death. In the day that you sin, that is the day that you die, according to those principles. That's how I usually, begin the subject of forgiveness to help people get started in that. But this was something that Paul really wanted to emphasize with them, that this is what he was wanting to get through to them. Okay, now it could also be that they just didn't receive it very well, and that's why he may not have been able to get any farther than that, because they were not very cooperative, when it came to that. We don't have that much information at our disposal. But there's a difference between the testimony of God and the wisdom of God. The testimony is something that he shares. That's something that we can all participate in. But the revelation of his wisdom is something else. All right, so he didn't go to them with impressive speaking, with excellence of speech or of wisdom. He didn't go to them with some sense of proclamation of great wisdom, again, because it's not for him to do that. The idea of excellence of speech, all right, where this really comes from is from explaining the wisdom of the world. Okay, the wisdom of the world is something that generally has to be persuaded. Okay, even though people will normally come to these conclusions on their own, they often have to be persuaded that this is important. That whatever the wisdom is, this is meaningful. And so we need to say it well. We need to say it in a way that people are willing to listen to it. Okay? Maybe be entertaining in some way, even. All right? And so those who are highly skilled at presenting, content, those who are highly skilled at communicating with other people, they would use these skills in order to express the wisdom of the world, to justify what they were saying, to be able to deal with a lot of the questions that would come up that people would be concerned about. And so this excellence of speech, the person can really say these things of the world. Okay, if a person can really say them in a persuasive way, in a way that these people can understand, then we put that in the category of excellence of speech. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think there's a place for that. I try to do that myself, in order to encourage people a little bit more and to hopefully get through to them, to have their attention long enough. Because there's a lot of topics like these that require uninterrupted, presentation to get through them in a reasonable way. So there's a place for that. But what he was emphasizing was, instead of that, all I was doing was just telling you the way things are. That's all I was doing, just testifying of what God did. Nothing more than that. And this did not have to be presented in some kind of formal setting, in a formal way, with a certain amount of time allocated for it. It wasn't about that. It's not about that. It's about, hey, I want you to know that the person of our God, he did something, and this is what he did. That's it. The testimony of what he did. He provided us with forgiveness. He has forgiven us. And the way that he demonstrated that was through the crucifixion. But that's what that was about. All right, going back to verse 1. And I, brethren, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom, declaring to you the testimony of God. He didn't need to. All right, when you're giving the testimony of God, you don't need to have, some excellence of speech. You don't need to present it in a formal way like everybody's used to. Just tell it like it is. Tell people who he is. This is the God that you know. Testify of him. Say, you know what? This is something that I believe that he has revealed to me. I think this is interesting. You don't have to get complicated. You don't have to get eloquent. You just let it out. All right? And that's what he's saying. Look, I just came to testify of God. There is a God. And he has an opinion about certain things. Really, just anything. I'm sure he has an opinion. Testify that God did something. This is something that he did. He did it way over there, but he did that. And considering what he did over there, it actually has an effect on us over here. There's no need to get elaborate about it. That's what he's saying. There's no need for that whatsoever. So don't be persuaded by somebody who just seems to be a good talker, and maybe has a great following. You don't need to be persuaded by things like that. We want to know our God. That goes back at the end of chapter 1. This is about knowing him. Okay, we don't need a lot of elaborate speeches in order to know him. We just need the basics, to get started with, and so that we can draw near to him, so that we can rest in him, and so that he can speak to us in a way that we individually can understand, which he will, and through the life that we live. Verse 2. For I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And again, this, as I said earlier, this could be just because they couldn't get much further than that for various reasons. But what's important is to see that Paul mentions that the forgiveness issue is the issue that really has the greatest importance. And I'll tell you that it has the greatest importance because if you don't make it past that one, then you can't get to anything else. You don't go anywhere. All right? The wisdom of God certainly will not be accessible to you because what's he going to say? What do you expect him to show you? What do you expect him to reveal to you if you're not going to believe that the sin issue is over? All right? And you consider the people who do not believe the sin issue is over. Do they know anything about the wisdom of God? All right, that's an open question. I'm not giving an answer to that question. I'm not going to pass judgment. I don't need to do that. God has not sent me to do that. I have no interest in that. But you will find that it will be very unusual for any real wisdom to be presented or to be testified of from a person who does not know that the sin issue really has come to an end. Okay, so with them, they also need to know Jesus Christ and him crucified because they don't quite know him yet. All right, they haven't made it past that quite yet. So as you can see today, there is a significant struggle, with finding somebody who can make it past that. So also back then, why would you be so surprised if it was any different? I don't think it was any different at all. People are still the same. They still struggle with the same issues. They're still going to have the same concerns. Back then they would be thinking, well, I'm not sure about this forgiveness thing because then I can go out and sin like the devil and God won't hold it against me. So what's going to keep me from doing that? Those are the same issues today as I'm sure that they were having conversations about back then. Okay, I'm going to pause here just because this is kind of the completion of this particular subject. In verse 3, he goes into some other things, and so I'm just going to pause here, and that'll give me more to work with as I proceed into chapter 2. So here's the question. Okay, for those of you who are using this for your small groups, I know this message is kind of short. Sorry about that. If you were expecting something longer, you can listen to another one, that I've done previously to help fill in some time if you just feel like you need a little bit more. But here's the question to consider. What is the wisdom of the cross? How would you describe the wisdom of the cross? Just a general open-ended question. What does that mean to you, the wisdom of the cross? What does that mean? Okay? And I'll continue into the rest of chapter 2 in the next message. Thanks.